Today I'm going to be transforming a pile of plastic sprues into a fully assembled, based, and battle-ready collection of miniature mechs, each one a little diorama of its own. I had a lot of fun with this one, and I hope you enjoy. Like usual, the first thing I did to prepare my workspace for the week was to clean off my hobby mat. After using some isopropyl alcohol, I used a secret solution to get rid of the stubborn stuff. And I'm always surprised at how well that works. I went to the Gundam Base mobile tour 2 weeks ago when it happened to be in Denver. I went with a very specific mission, and that was to find these promo minis for the upcoming tabletop Gundam wargame. I didn't find them there, so I actually had to order these from Japan. As you can see, the minis come with the start deck of the Gundam Card Game, titled Gundam Card Game. Each box has 3 minis, and that's what I'm here for. I carefully opened the boxes to harvest the minis, and like I said, I'm mostly just interested in the war game, not the card game, titled Gundam Card Game, at least at the moment. So I'm going to leave the cards in the packages, and I'm going to send them to one of you. If you're interested in the card game, or you know someone who is, make sure the phrase Gundam Card Game is in your comment. I'll filter those out and choose from that collection of comments randomly and send this to the winner. I'll pin the winning comment next week. I thought this sheet of paper might have some additional information about Gundam Assemble, but it was just team rules for the Gundam Card Game, so I made sure that got back in the box. I pulled the other minis from their boxes and bags, and some of them were a little bit more stubborn than others. I nipped and snipped the minis from their runners and snap fit them together in classic Bandai fashion. I did use some plastic cement, however, in a few places to hold the smaller pieces together. That way I wouldn't have any unfortunate little pieces jumping off of my workspace and being lost to the void, which is a pretty common occurrence for me. The design and engineering on these minis is very high quality, as is to be expected from Bandai. It's also fun to see what elements made it from their larger kits down to this smaller size. Feels like kind of a fun little crossover. So these are just promo minis, and I believe the full game is going to be played on a hex grid with hexagonal bases, rather than these round ones. I am hoping that there will be some open battlefield play options as well. I feel like that'll be more fun for terrain. But I am curious about the gameplay, but I'm more interested in the minis. I feel like I will have a lot more fun with the minis than the game. I took a moment to appreciate the quality of these little gray plastic minis, but the next step is what I was looking forward to most, and that is the basing. But before doing any of the basing, I of course had to do a little bit of cleanup, removing mold lines, sprue marks, and of course, drilling out all the little gun barrels. Also, if you're curious about the size of Gundam Assemble minis next to another war game, here is a Gandalf from Games Workshop, which actually gives me an idea for a crossover. Nah. I was actually quite curious about the real-life scale of these minis, and I couldn't find it online, so I decided to take some measurements and figure it out myself. I used this formula with Char's real-life Zaku compared to the miniature one, and I came up with something around 1 to 350, which is honestly a pretty fun scale for a wargame. I organized the minis into 2 categories, based enough for a cool base and not based enough for a cool base. I did change the qualifications for that later on, and gave everyone a cool base except for the Skygrasper, who just got the Void of Space, with stars. When I saw that Bandai was releasing a minigame, the thing I was most excited for was the ability to base the minis. So that they were larger than most tabletop minis, but also at a tinier scale than most minis, and the potential for unique diorama-like bases was too much of a temptation for me to stay away from. For this first Zaku, he looked like he had just landed from a jump or a fall, which I thought would be perfect for a small bit of dynamic basing. I used some corkboard to create some earth, which I cracked up. I have a small bit of it flying up in the air as in the middle of being punched. Nothing too crazy, just enough to imply the force of the impact. To blend the corkboard into the base, I used some earth effects paints from Citadel. Next, I was originally going to work on Char's Zaku, but shortly after getting into the construction, I decided to swap to a different mini. I used more corkboard to create some concrete, and then I had 3 large sewer pipes emerging from that. At this scale, you could paint up the road surface with traffic markings, you could add small buildings, vegetation, or create whatever effect you were after. Like I said, the possibility for these playable dioramas is endless, and one of the best ways to tell a story with your mini. For this base, I decided to use styrene to create a nice smooth surface on the street level, which I scored to have some cracks in it. And I tried to use a nice variety of materials and techniques for these bases to keep things interesting as I moved from base to base. Like I said, I decided to switch the owner of this base last minute to someone who is in more of an action pose rather than just chillin'. But for the dude who is just chillin', I found this cool gang box electrical cover thing with concentric circles that looked like a cool design for an outer space platform of some kind. I don't necessarily know if a platform like this has ever actually been shown in the Gundam universe, but it felt like it fit the aesthetic. Actually, I feel like the design of the Gundam universe is perfect for the kit bashing style that I enjoy. And I'm very excited to make some larger terrain pieces for the game at some point in the future, probably after it's released next year. To finish up this space platform, I ran some ambiguous space cables through the tubes underneath and wrapped some trim around the rim. Next up were the Strike Gundams. I was given a cool circle drawing ring for Christmas last year, which I've used a number of times, but for some reason not much on camera. It was a gift from my grandpa, so I just want to give a shout out to him and say thank you for that nice gift. The Sword Strike was in a great pose to be positioned at an angle. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but the idea was to mount him on a beam on the base to make him look a little bit more imposing. When doing bases with off-centered elements like this, it's important to make sure that the weight stays above the center. Otherwise, you could have it tip over easily. Nobody likes an easily tippable mini. Next up was the Launch Strike Gundam, which I wanted to be floating on a platform. So I flipped over a pre-made resin rock and built a landing pad on the back of it. The idea is that it's something that would be floating around on an asteroid belt or in some low gravity situation, like a moon base or something like that. The platform got some steps, which I guess don't make much sense in zero gravity. It also got a little antenna, and the Gundam was ready to be glued down. The next mini to make a base for, I was very excited about, and that was the Tall Geese. The pose was perfect for what I'm going to call the ribcage of a large crashed ship. I've seen things like this made for Gundam or Star Wars ship displays and dioramas, and I thought it would suit this model perfectly. Thankfully, I had 3 of these exact same plastic bits with evenly spaced pre-drilled holes and some styrene rods that fit right between them, making it very easy and fun to put together. I used an offcut from the angled beam that I cut earlier as a wedge to hold the debris at the correct angle. I used some 040 styrene as leftover metal panels for the fuselage. Styrene bends and creases like metal, making it the perfect option for this step. After scuffing up the base with a file, I used more of that earth texture paint from Citadel to blend everything together, and I am really happy with the way that this turned out. For the space type Leo, I decided to have some floating debris to suggest that he was indeed floating in space. It's probably the most fragile and precarious of the bases I made, but just like apes, debris together strong. So I made sure to glue stuff together, so it's a little more durable than it could be. For the other Leo, I opted for a classic destroyed cityscape, using more cork for the ground and then a piece of 3D printing support material as a broken concrete pillar. After a little plastic I-beam, I moved over to the gun cannon and the gun tank, who both only got texture paint, because there wasn't really much room on the bases otherwise. The last mini to make a base for was the RX-78-2. I definitely drew inspiration from something I saw on Pinterest. It's outstanding work and a very helpful visual for my own base. I did of course take my own liberties with it, and definitely did not go into the same level of detail, but I had a lot of fun throwing this base together and seeing my Gundam posed on top of it. Of all the bases that I made, this one is probably my favorite, and I'm looking forward to making more in the future. As you can see, my workspace is a thorough mess, which is an indication of the fun I was having. With a nice clear workspace, I can now lay them all out and show you my collection of fully based minis. But as you can see, they're still gray, which means it's time to paint. So I brought back my dirty hobby mat, and I broke out my airbrush. I'm going to be priming all of these with a matte black primer from Vallejo. When it came to painting these minis, there were a variety of approaches that I could take. Some of the minis were a solid color, while others were mostly white with spots of color, and others were a mix. So after getting all of them primed black, I sorted them into a few different groups. All the minis with primarily white armor, I gave a zenithal highlight with a light gray. It looks white on camera, but it is light gray. Later on, I'll be using pure white to highlight all of these panels. If I had used pure white for this step, none of those highlights would show up later. After the light gray, I moved over to the colorful minis and worked in the opposite direction. The goal here was for the purple to be the primary shadow color, except for the deepest recesses, which would remain black. While purple was still in the airbrush, I took the opportunity to add ivory in small amounts and build up the highlights on the space type Leo. I switched the purple out for a pale red, which I repeated the brightening process for. Char ended up being a little bit more deep red than he should have been, but I'll fix that later with a brush. I gave the gun cannon the almost fire truck red that suit needed, and then I switched over to all the cool colored suits. The three green guys got a bluish purple shadow color, followed by a teal midtone, followed by progressively lighter and lighter shades of green. To get those lighter and lighter shades of green, I mixed yellow and ivory to the teal that I started with. Once all three of the green minis had their base coats, I switched over to the gun tank. The gun tank had an about even mix of blue, red, and gray base colors that needed to be applied to the airbrush, which were unique to him, so he didn't have to share his airbrushing session with anybody else. With all the airbrushed base coats on, it was time to switch to the detail work. All the white armor had colors that needed to be picked out with a brush before I could apply the highlights. I used thinned down Vallejo acrylic paints or contrast paints for this step. I went color by color rather than mini by mini for this step, keeping the same color on my brush. There are some unique colors like the magenta on the Sword Strike Gundam, but most of the colors are shared between all of these. After the brushed on base colors had all been applied, the minis were looking pretty good. It was now time to switch over to the wet palette for the highlights and really make this armor pop. I loaded up the palette with a few main colors to mix everything else from, and from here on out I'll mostly be focusing on one mini at a time, painting it all the way to completion. The Tall Geese is definitely the most imposing of the mobile suits that I painted today. The color scheme, the huge pauldrons, the eagle-clad shield, and the centurion-like crest on the helmet definitely make a bold statement. And while none of the mobile suits that I painted today have wings, I would definitely revisit the Tall Geese Flugel with wings and a lance, if that comes out in the future. After the brush work, I used a warm Rusty Earth pigment powder on the base. Shout out to Squidmar for the pigment powder tip. And speaking of Squidmar, I see that they released a Gundam video as of recording this video. I'm going to stop and watch that, and I'll check back in a second. That was a fun video. I liked it. I decided to do the green Zaku at the same time. They pretty much have identical color requirements, except for the Heat Hawk, which I think contrasts against the bluish green very nicely. This might be my favorite color combination of any of the minis that I painted today. After wrapping up the painting on the minis, I touched up the bases, and I added some enamel pin wash to one to bring out those cracks, and then more pigment powder to the other. After the Zaku, I detailed the Sword Strike Gundam and the Launch Strike Gundam to completion, and when they were done I felt like they were lacking some contrast. So I did go back off camera with a pin wash panel liner, and I'm trying not to rely on washes as much, but in this case I feel like it really did the trick. The floating platform got a coat of bluish green and a red antenna, and then I took the moment to break out the black 3.0 and paint the deep darkness of space. on this base and all the other ones that needed it. I will add some stars to all those bases later in the video, but now that I'm looking at it, I think some kind of colorful wispy nebulas would look better. So I probably will repaint those bases at some point in the future. Speaking of space, the next mini that I finished was the Space Type Leo. Painted up the armor and the space debris. The other Leo got the same treatment, but rather than purple, it was green, and the base isn't full of space debris, rather ground debris. The gun tank, the gun cannon, and the RX-78-2 are from the original Mobile Suit Gundam series, and are noticeably less flashy and detailed than some of the other mobile suits. But I feel like Bandai did a good job modeling them with a nice amount of detail, still preserving their original designs, but helping them blend into a table full of more detailed minis. I feel like that could have been a challenge to try and find a happy medium, but I think they did a good job of it. Also, I only realized this after the fact, but the parts that make up the Sky Grasper could have been used to make one of the Strike Gundam into the Ale Strike Gundam, which I honestly would have done in retrospect. The second to last mini to paint was Char's Red Zaku. And like I said before, I didn't quite get the red right, so I did a little bit of color matching on the palette to get things in a better place. With the right shade of pink as my highlight color, I reworked all the armor plates that needed it and got the rest of the individual darker colors on as well. After a quick slapping of paint on the space platform, on the base, and a little bit of a pin wash to muck it up a bit, it was time to move on to my favorite mini of the bunch. The OG Gundam is definitely a simple one, but it's just so classic and iconic looking. And also, I really like how the base turned out. I feel like it frames the mini nicely. I used the bases to experiment with a style of painting that I have never really done before, which is really thin paints, kind of slapped on in a really loose way. And I'm really happy with the way they look, especially contrasted against the more stark lines of the mobile suits. I will definitely be using that technique in the future. The last bit of detail work was, of course, some pure white paint for the stars. I probably should have done more to spice up the Sky Grasper's base.
But at least they've got stars on them.
After all the little dots of light had been added to every surface that was Black 3.0, the last thing I did to tie all these paint jobs together visually was to apply a bit of a tint using a very thin down red wash. And the last thing to do was to paint the rim of each of these gaming miniatures with black. Just plain flat black. And after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out, as always, to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.